Good Shabbos. This week's Parsha is Chayei, and most of the Parsha deals with the marriage of Yitzchak. But not like a modern romantic story. It's really Yitzchak's father, Avram, sends out Eliezer, his servant, to a far-off land to find a wife for Yitzchak. And she comes back, and when they meet, it says, finally, after everything is said and done, it says Yitzchak brings Rivka into the tent of Sarah, his mother. Vayikach as Rivka, he takes Rivka vatihilo leisha, and she is to him as a wife. Vaye'alveha, and he loves her. Vayinachem Yitzchak achar imo, and Yitzchak is consoled after the passing of his mother. So there's much to say about here why it specifically states that he brings her into the tent of Sarah, his mother, and that he's consoled of his mother's death when it's talking about the marriage of Yitzchak and Rivka. But I'd like to just focus on really one aspect here, and that is, and is often stated in many traditional sources, that really you cannot love someone before marriage, but rather, as it's stated here, he took her as a wife, and then Vayeva, and then he loved her. So he married her, and then he came to love her. Love isn't something which is romantic. It's not love at first sight. It's something which develops over time, after finally committing, living with someone, developing a relationship, and perhaps a family, and that's when love truly begins. And that's obvious from this story that that's how it happened with Yitzchak. But the question is that what Judaism specifically teaches us? And maybe even more specifically, is that what the Torah is telling us is the only way that we have love and marriage in Jewish tradition? And the truth is, many commentaries who focus on this and try to understand that marriage is only afterwards are really disregarding later story in regard to Yaakov. Yaakov, as we know the story, he meets Rachel when he's coming to into the town, and he meets her at the well, and it says that there's two sisters, Rachel and Leah, and it says Rachel was very beautiful, Vayev Yaakov is Rachel, and Yaakov loved Rachel. It says he met her, she was beautiful, he loved her, then he approaches Lavan, her father, and says, I'd like to marry her, and they strike a deal that he works for 7 years, and then we know how the story unfolds. But when you look at that story, you see that no, that in that case, love precedes the marriage, and it might even look on the surface as an infatuation. Others would argue, but it doesn't really matter. Whatever the nature of the love was, you see that love could happen before marriage. So which is the ideal, which is the way it works, and which is what is the suggested approach within Judaism? And I would suggest that really there is no suggested approach. I think that it could happen either way. And I think it depends on the personalities and the people involved. And I've spoken about this other times. Yitzchak seems to be more of a passive personality. And that's not necessarily a negative trait. That's just the way he is. And it's good for him in many different ways. We see Yitzchak being passive and accepting the fact that he's brought as a sacrifice by Avram, his father. And there's not that many stories about Yitzchak, as other commentators point out. It almost is giving you a vision of Yitzchak as being someone who's more passive. Whereas when you look at the stories of Avram or Yaakov, there's much activity in many different stories and involvements that they have, and they're much more active. Just as in one simple regard, Yitzchak, when there's a famine, is starts to travel to look for food, and God comes to him in a vision or a dream, and he says, don't leave the land. You have to stay where you are. Avram didn't stay where he was when there was a famine, and Yaakov didn't stay where he was when he had to look for a wife. A wife wasn't brought to him. He was the one who actively pursued it. Not only that, Yitzchak, his father, was the one who sent him to get a wife for himself and in the household of Lavan. So we see that Yitzchak not only understood the only way for marriage is for someone to deliver your wife to you and then decide that you're going to love her or come to love her after much time, but rather for Yaakov, he felt it was different. Rivka also felt that way. Rivka herself was the one who chooses a mate. In this story, Rivka says, when she's asked, will you go? She says, yes, I will go. She's the one who's making the decision. So even in this particular story, she's the one she's not necessarily falling in love with Yitzchak because she hasn't met him yet. All she's seen is the gifts and the stories that she's told, but she's making a decision to marry Yitzchak, to go down that path and to travel to a foreign land. So what we see is it really depends on the personality. And for some people, the way to go through life is much more passive, accepting, to be more stoic. Take your fate, deal with what you have, and then learn to live with it. And in this particular case, learn to live with a woman who you come to love. And that's not necessarily negative. Hopefully it works out well. But many, many times that even in arranged marriages, if you look around today, arranged marriages have a better rate of success than marriages that are romantic marriages. Now, you could argue that it's because divorce is frowned upon and they're not really happy. But I would venture to say that generally most of these marriages, a good percentage of them, are happy marriages, even though it might have been arranged. Why? Because the expectations in that particular case are that it's going to be arranged, and you understand your situation, and you come to deal with it, and learn to live with it, and eventually come to love someone. And that's the way it worked in more ancient times, generally speaking. But we see there are exceptions to the rule. We see that Yaakov, no, he fell in love and he pursued the love that he had. And it actually ends up somewhat tragically in many different ways. But we understand that Rachel is an important wife to Yaakov, even though he has more than one wife, and the children that he has from Rachel are the future leaders of the Jewish people. So, or at least in the near future. So we see that's appropriate for Yaakov, but what's not necessarily appropriate for Yitzchak. So therefore, I would just suggest that there is no simple answer to the question of what comes first, love or marriage, but rather we have to look at ourselves. We have to understand what kind of personality we are, how we approach life in general. Some of us could change from a more passive to a more active, or vice versa, but most of us tend to go in the way we are, so and the way we always were, and the character trait that we're born with. And the question isn't always to change your character trait, although it's always important to improve upon any personality trait that you have and make sure to do away with the negative traits and focus on the positive ones and develop more fully your positive traits. At the end of the day, being active or passive is not necessarily negative or positive, and therefore really our job in life is to learn to live with how we are and to accommodate ourselves to that, and to value who we are, and to value that in other people, and not to look at other people and say, why are you this way, why are you that way, isn't this the way, that should be the way, it should only be one specific way. No, there's a much more we have a much more liberal attitude in the Torah than you would think at first, and there's many different approaches to life. And hopefully we all take this as a lesson that we have to really just learn to live with what we were given by God, and then we have to make the most of it. And hopefully, if we approach that in life, then whether it's marriage, whether it's business opportunities, whether it's a profession, everything starts to fall into place as long as you have the attitude that your job is to deal with what you have or who you are rather than try to be someone else. Good Shabbos.